Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Another day, another dollar, like they say. So let's continue. And today I'll just focus more on detail about what the SOS is all about. So, you know, last time kind of argued that for realizing sustainability, ownership is nowhere to be found, really. And at the same time, we have not succeeded since 2000, with the Millennium Development Goals. And then in 2015, we had the SDGs, and all of them remain a work in progress. And we seem to be doing worse every day. Year to year, it doesn't seem to get better. There isn't more resource allocation for sustainability or anything like that. So, sovereignty is essential, is the argument. And for sovereignty to happen, you actually need to be committed to do the resource mobilization yourself. You can't claim sovereignty while expecting others to, basically do the heavy lifting for you. And I understand that the world has not been, uh, let's say, equity driven or justice driven in any way, shape, or form. However, uh, at the end of the day, you can only hold yourself accountable. As an individual, as a company, or as a country, you have to make a decision. You can point out the abuse others are doing or their lip service to whatever sustainability objectives or targets we've put in place. But at the end of the day, you can't force others, you know, uh, to behave in a certain way. We're a long way from that. That's what I mean by we need social evolution to happen. So, what are the earlier I mentioned that greed, mm, corruption, and ignorance are defining features of the world in terms of social. Yeah. So social evolution is not really happening. It doesn't mean that people by default are bad as individuals. However, the social systems they've managed to develop is well, I don't have to say much. You just have to open your window, look out into the world, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So, with to bring about ownership, we want to basically do local resource mobilization, and this is the part I'll talk about today. How you do it specifically, and this will definitely give you ownership. And the moment you're using your local resources, then even if there is greed, corruption, and ignorance, you can actually work. This empowers you a great deal. If it's money that's coming from somewhere else, then the accountability mechanisms tend to be very limited or have very little success. Because even when wherever the resource is coming from, you know, if you go to the World Bank sites, you get to see a lot of contracts, organizations that have been, you know, listed as having bribed their way into contracts or things like that. And what ends up happening is that they get shortlisted for a few months, and then they can bid again. So it's, you just kind of doing the world over. Uh, it's not a global South problem. It's not a global North problem. It's a human problem. All these futures. So uh, you know, unless you're intentionally trying to be a hypocrite, you know, there's no point really trying to argue. Uh, Another example maybe I'd like to give you is there might be places where they have least corruptions, and maybe they're doing a pretty good job in terms of addressing sustainability in their own little. But when you see how they generate their resources, they might as well be, as extractive, if not more extractive than other places, meaning that actually they manage to use their wealth for their development through basically extracting others. And I also want you to think that, you know, sustainability is not really about money. So uh, you need it, you need resources, inputs to do the work, but it's I'm presenting it as a business model, okay, not as a just let's do good for the sake of doing good. It actually is helping society transform for the better to become more wealthy, not just financially rich. And so, how do you do the local resource mobilization? So we have the SOS, Sovereign Operating System, that is designed to take you to sovereign sustainability to achieve that. And big part of what we talked about is social evolution. And these two are, the moment you improve social evolution, like meaning in a positive way to address these three ills we talked about, then you're contributing towards sovereign sustainability. And the moment you're addressing sovereign sustainability with the resource you're mobilizing, then you're helping people move socially in terms of really improving your social dynamics. So they kind of feed on each other. So an investment in one is actually an investment on another, and one serves as the input for the next. So they're kind of tag teaming with each other. So I'm not looking at them. Actually, nothing in here. This is all systems thinking based. So nothing happens in isolation. That's why there is no really linear perspective here. It's mostly dynamics and it grows. If you put two little things together, you might end up having an exponential growth. So how do you do the local resource mobilization? Like I mentioned the last time, you have champion inputs. Okay. And what are the champion inputs? Your strategic assets. Okay. And what are the strategic assets? I'll pick Ethiopia for now because the book I'm writing uses coffee. Okay. As Ethiopia's strategic asset. In the past, Ethiopia considered coffee not as a strategic asset. To this day, it doesn't. Right now, the government at least talks about coffee being a strategic commodity. For me, I consider it to be way more than that. So, evolutionarily, in the past, it was looked at as forex, okay? And then that became more institutionalized starting in the 1950s. And because we were a feudal system between the 1950s, before 1974 revolution, land was a major issue. Land and people's rights. I'm not here to criticize history or whether we took the right path or wrong path, but I'm just highlighting for you the things so that you can see where the system came from. And then in the 1991, we tried to open it to the private sector. Here we became socialist or military regime that subscribed to socialist and communist principles. So this was, and here after this, we try to bring in private companies. So here, private companies existed. Modern plantations started happening around the 1920s after World War One, and then we had our first legal framework that established coffee boards. But what I want you to pay attention to is, for me, the biggest mark is 1989. Okay, the world decided that there is no need for a quota system And when I mean by the world, consuming countries. It was not in the best interest of consuming countries to have a quota system because production was becoming, it's supply and demand. So in the past, supply was always an issue. So they wanted to have a quota system where different countries are, basically supplying to the global system. Price was fixed and the like. And after 1989, you know, supply they figured would be more than adequate. So they abandoned the quota system, and whether the coffee is being sold at the cost of production or not, whether smallholder farmers and producing countries were making, that's not the problem of the system any longer. Okay, that was a conscious decision. And so, global market started favoring consuming or raw coffee importing countries. Okay, that's fine. They do the value addition, you could argue, but the relationship from here to producing is extractive. Okay, people will tell you about being cost effective, optimizing profit, this and that, but it's not always that. Okay, actually, most of the time it's not. For example, the issue of freshness. Okay, when you talk about freshness, a coffee roasted in Ethiopia will always be fresher than a coffee roasted in the United States or Europe or Asia. Okay, the simple reason that you tend to transport roasted coffee by air. Okay, not ship. And if you're dealing with purely Ethiopian coffees, then you're better off roasting them in Ethiopia. The primary issue was roasting. So you're trying to balance different variables. It's not just about roasting, it's about logistics, it's the ability to mix different coffees to develop a particular product. And some places are more friendlier for that than others. And in this regard, producing countries have not always been, you know, uh, not aware. Not aware is the wrong word. More like ignorant. As long as they're getting whatever dollars come to them, because most of the coffee producing countries, one can argue that very few of them had or still has a government that is committed to the national cause. So let's stick with Ethiopia. With Ethiopia, just like the global system is extractive, the national system is also extractive. Okay? You definitely don't want to be a smallholder farmer in Ethiopia if you're dealing with coffee. Where you want to be is in the export. Okay? Because the system is geared towards dollars, it favors the person that does the exporting. And the reason actually I've been developing this concept over the past few years more aggressively is because Ethiopia is going through a reform process. Okay. And that reform process involves liberalizing the economy. And so, to give you a simple perspective, Ethiopia is opening up its communication, financial, wholesale, retail to the international world. So dollar could come in and out much easily. So if this is the case, in 2017 was the last time Ethiopia had a major reform, but with coffee. Okay, and even then, if you look at the structure, how the supply chain functions, and where value is retained at the national level, okay, uh, there is very little difference between our feudal system that had, the peasant, Chisegna. Chisegna is a word that we use in Ethiopia, which means, there's the feudal, the landlord, and the peasant who does not own the land but has an arrangement like a serf. So we call them Chisegna. Okay. And basically, they have very little decision making power over the product they produce. That's a very, basically, they give a portion of it to the landlord, and even any kind of business they want to do with whatever resources that they have there, it tends to, uh, you know, the landlord has a lot of decision on it. So, but the main defining feature is that whatever you're using the land for, whatever you're producing, you have very little say. You get to keep a portion of it for your own subsistence. You are expected to hand over a good portion of what you produced to the landlord. That was until 1974. And then after that, we nationalized land. But we never really gave the land to the peasants. We gave them user rights. Even to this day, both urban, rural land, it's public property. Okay, so you have a leaser right. You can do contract farming, different kind of mechanisms. Uh, so today, a coffee farmer, a smallholder coffee farmer, is actually legally expected to hand over his or her coffee to either a supplier or an exporter. Anyway, either one of them will have a processing site, either a wet mill or a dry mill. Okay. If you're producing coffee and there isn't a fixed number, but you're expected to push 70% of the product to the export channel. Okay. And a smallholder farmer gets paid in birr, an exporter. Now, these days, all the benefits, even under the current reform, go towards the exporter. They can keep their money in dollars. Okay. That's one. Another is, so now we call it outgrowers. Okay. And in Ethiopia, what makes the system even more like Chisegna than a liberating one is that the local market is more lucrative, the coffee local market, more lucrative as a green coffee business than an export one. So that's one. The second one, so if the closest market to you is the most lucrative one, then you should be allowed to sell it. But from my system, I look at equity. Okay, it's not about doing right or wrong. It's about equity, meaning that coffee can be exported. Teff can be exported. It's a cereal that we grow here in Ethiopia. Uh, Barley could be exported. Wheat can be exported. Ethiopia grows all these. Okay. But Ethiopia does not have a law that asks smallholder farmers that grow teff, barley, or wheat to dedicate a portion of their production to be exported. Okay. But it does that for coffee. So if you look at the constitution of Ethiopia, whatever laws or systems you establish, it's supposed to treat, you know, uh, citizens equally. So here, you know, I'm not a hardcore legal person, but a case could be made that the current coffee legal framework is disproportionately affecting people that are smallholder coffee farmers by systematically denying them access to their local market. Okay. So it's extractive. So the reason I'm pointing this out is to tell you that from global to national, from national to uh, local, the system is extractive, designed that way. So basically, the people with the land resource, the time resource, the labor resource, who do the investment to do growing, get the least, and whoever receives it afterwards and keep pushing it up the value chain gets the most return. And there is an internal dynamics that facilitates that extraction, and there is a global dynamics that facilitates that extraction. Okay. And traditional sustainability models have not worked. And how do I know that? If you look at the data, there's very little change in the systematic empowerment of smallholder coffee farmers. Okay. The majority of the coffee is produced by them. So if actually there was a study some years back, a story was written, I think the Economist or one of the papers, that globally when coffee is retailed, I think, but at the end of the day, from I think a 3 something pound cup of coffee, very small amount reaches the smallholder farmer. The biggest beneficiary is actually the person who holds the real estate. Okay. The person who's renting you the coffee house. Even the coffee owner, the coffee house owner, is not the one. I think the top three are the real estate owner, the employees who get salary, and the taxman. Okay, the government. These are the top three beneficiaries of all this work. Okay, and the status of a smallholder farmer has not changed much. Actually, what is so fascinating is that if you adjust for inflation, the value of coffee before the abandonment of the price quota system in 1989, I think today will be somewhere around tenfold the price of coffee. The price of coffee has fluctuated slightly in the last couple of years. It's become a bit more expensive, so the multiplication might have changed. But you were better off being a coffee farmer before 1989 than afterwards. Okay, that's how the system has gotten more efficient at facilitating data extraction. So, how does the local resource mobilization work? It's actually a levy system, okay? However, it's not just a random number. It needs to be a dynamic levy system. Okay, levy means parafiscal, a tax, but you apply it on the raw output and before and the raw output that is prepared for export. So what this means is that, and you determine the amount, the percentage of a levy by sensitivity analysis. Okay. So sensitivity analysis is a systems dynamics approach. So basically, you look at the global trend. So when for coffee, for example, you could look at the price crash of the early 1990s as a time where you decide. When I said agnostic and modular, each producing community with authority to apply a levy could decide what to adapt. Okay, uh, I I'm not here to do prescriptive. I'm here to give you a system that is adaptive. That way, you could adapt it to reality. But this levy, at least based on the simulation I've done for Ethiopia, if you take the data from the previous year, uh, about 3% is the ideal levy you need to apply on the export of raw green coffee. Okay. This does two things. One, if you do value addition, then you're not subject to this levy. And if you are using coffee to do anything else domestically, you're also not gonna be subject to this levy. And I'll explain this later. I'm just giving you as an example, but there is a rationale behind this. Okay. One, it makes no sense, especially after a year or two, for Ethiopia not to liberalize its domestic market for coffee. Okay. The current legal framework for coffee will not make any sense if you're liberalized your financial system, your forex, allowing the free movement of currencies, if you have liberalized wholesale, retail. Basically, the current system not only allows for foreign banks to come in and set up shop in Ethiopia, but also allows for global chains to come in and set up a coffee shop. So, the moment you do this, also, when retail shops come in, they'll be bringing in coffee that they've roasted potentially even somewhere else. So, the more liberalized and open system you're creating, you can't really dictate how businesses are going to operate. Otherwise, it's going to be a lip service for you to liberalizing that particular segment. So, you know, it's this system's perspective actually encourages you to streamline and align your system so that it operates optimally. So the levy is targeting that. And there's also a reason, okay? Let's assume that Ethiopia is a 50-50% country in terms of domestic or an export, okay? This is actually higher. When we go into detail later, I'll give you the data. It's more like 60-40, okay? But let's go 50-50 because that's, by the way, Ethiopia does not have a good domestic coffee related data. Neither does the Department of Agriculture of the US, ICO, or whatever. Export data, we have a decent, very good, because it's affiliated with, related with tax, this, that. So the export one, even all the contrabands that get smuggled out of the country, we have a pretty good data. But data on the ground, non-existent. Okay, there's a lot of assumptions and very little understanding of the domestic market because Ethiopia still consumes anywhere between around 85%, if not more, at home. Okay, so and I'll give you numbers. You'll get to read it in my book. I build the things case by case to show you. So the whole thing is meant to change. For me, if you are the producer, you should be the primary beneficiary. Okay, so smallholder farmers are key. You need to liberate it. And then you basically use market incentives to encourage whatever you encourage. Ethiopia right now forces the smallholder farmers to hand over its coffee, okay, rather than empowering them so that they systematically benefit from the market system you establish in a way that maximizes both return from export and also livelihood improvement for the producer. You could do those, you could do balancing. Okay. Now, so dynamic levy. Okay. Systems dynamics, sensitivity analysis. This is how you determine. And you need capable people to do this, but it doesn't have to be a big one. Basically, annually, the country decides, okay, this year when export starts this fiscal year, we basically be applying this much because the market is likely to behave this way. And we're gonna, if the coffee is going to become expensive in the global market, then you can get away with smaller percentage without affecting the global dynamics. And most people would say, "Oh, but it would make Ethiopian coffee expensive, this and that." That's why I say, you need to make sure that you identify it as a strategic asset for you. Do you hold something unique in in the world of coffee? Ethiopian coffees perform, amazingly well. The When the world of coffee significantly increases its price, Ethiopian coffees also increase their price, but they don't increase as much in terms of percentage like other coffees do. It's not that elastic. But when coffee prices dip significantly, it doesn't happen for Ethiopia's coffees. Okay, so there is a particular reason for that. It has a lot to do with its competitive advantages, the quality of its coffee, how it's viewed in the global market. So you have to take advantage of that, but not to benefit a few, but to benefit a lot. And the Ethiopian export system, okay, I'm not even sure there are 20 families that dominate the business, okay? So whatever export system you're putting in place, you're literally trying to benefit these guys, whatever privileges you're giving. And that's a fact. Data wise, we can argue. But, and this is not a criticism, it's just how the system is set up. The global buyers want to deal with a few. And historically, not just this government, the governments before, they find the logistics to be easily manageable. This is the numbers, okay? About 6.5 million people who grow coffee as a smallholder farmer, okay? About 5 to 7, maybe now it has increased, 1,000 suppliers. And license wise, maybe a couple of thousand exporters on paper, okay? And about 50 exporters that handle anywhere between 80 to 90% of the coffee. Okay, that leaves Ethiopia. And not only do they know each other, you know, there might be even families. Okay. And this is not a good or bad decision. They're just, making business decisions based on what the system allows. So until the government decides to change the status quo, nothing is going to change. But the way I argue for sovereign sustainability to come about, and why I recommend the SOS, is that if you want ownership, accountability, and the ability to address sustainability at a grassroots level, you have to do this. Okay, sustainability, the principle still doesn't change. You need to make sure economics makes sense, social makes sense, and environment makes sense. All the three components. Okay. And if it doesn't make at the community level, meaning that if you're extracting at the farm level from farmers, then it's not going to make at the national level. Okay. They already have an asset in their hand they could use to benefit themselves and improve their livelihood, their situation. And hopefully the Ethiopian coffee farmers have already proven to you that they already do it in a sustainable way because they do agroforestry. So, okay. Now, the dynamic levy, you have to actually, you know, so to do the simulation, I put together database to allow me to do that, an equation, and there are a few softwares you could use to do the simulation. Okay. But I'm just giving you here the details. Once you have a levy, let's just say 3%, because that's what the optimal place was. I think Ethiopia exported something like $2.7 billion worth of coffee. By the way, it's almost irrelevant to talk about value addition in Ethiopia because less than 0.5%. Theoretically, if you're asked to round off that number, then 99 point, 6 whatever percent that is will become 100. So let's not even waste our time talking about we do value addition in export. Okay, we don't. And it's not because we don't know roasting. If we are roasting more coffee locally to do local consumption, and if the coffee scene in Ethiopia is the most dynamic and amazing one, you know, because it's completely detached from one's income level, there is no place like that in the world. If you go to the Scandinavian countries, they drink coffee and they love coffee because their wealth allows them. It's insignificant for them. There is no commitment behind it. So the question becomes, would they commit as much? Because Ethiopians commit significant amount of their income for coffee. It actually contributes to one of the things we track as non-alcoholic and coffee in the to determine the inflation level in the country. So it might even end up improving your, domestic dynamics when it comes to inflation because Ethiopia consistently had high inflation, and it's only this year that we managed to bring it under 10%. A couple of years ago, a few years back, it was 30%, 40%. That's what's even documented and reported by the national government. Okay, we have a lot of informal. The majority of our business activities are informal, so you could only imagine what the benefit of coffee could be in that. So now you need a team, a technical team, and also you need a mechanism for managing this resource. My model does not advocate for sending this percent that you collect. So for this, it's about, I think, 80 to $90 million annually. $1 million would be collected annually. Okay. And it doesn't go to government cover directly. You need a special account that determines how that money is going to be used for two reasons. We've already determined that greed, corruption, and ignorance are defining features of most of our states the world over. Ethiopia for sure. You don't even have to look at me, just go and read the government reports. Okay? So you need a mechanism to make sure that this resource is being invested the way it's intended to. And so remember I said the levy, the dynamic levy, goes into social goods, R&D, and strategic ventures. Okay, that's what we called for. These first two in my model is mandatory. Okay, these two. This one is optional and dependent. So you may not necessarily do strategic venture support every year. There is a reason why these two are mandatory. The R&D is actually the resource you mobilize and whatever resource you allocated for that. Here as well, you have to do a sensitivity analysis using system dynamics stuff we talked about earlier to determine the levy, to determine how much resource you're going to allocate between these three. So it's not random, it's not political. It needs to be sheltered as much as possible from political actors. It needs to be placed in a way that facilitates technocrats and technical people to determine this. And Ethiopia has the mechanism. Ethiopia has established the sovereign wealth Ethiopian investment holdings, and it basically runs all the state enterprises. And increasingly, it is making a more efficient, more commercial, more accountable, and more profitable. So it is already adapting something that my system has already recognized and wants to actually strengthen that. moving forward. And also, I'm aware that Ethiopia has tried to uh, use EIH to enter the coffee sector, but hasn't really make a decision. It's made a decision, and it is considered partnering with some international organizations to do that. Doesn't matter how you go about it, but it needs to be said that uh, it needs a plan, it needs a system, it needs a framework. How are you going to go about it? Because coffee is such a not just a strategic asset, but it is already established itself, and there's so many stakeholders that are pulling different strings that you need to prove that the model is not only fair and adequate, but also improves everybody's perspective or benefit from the overall system. Because there will be people, if you pitch anything that talks about levy or anything, all the exporters, no matter how few they are, will complain. But there is already another case study I'll bring out. It's the Oromia regional state recently introduced 5% tax uh, on the export of coffee, and there are different mechanisms to it. You might get reimbursed if that coffee ends up being exported, but any coffee that is produced uh, in the Oromia region will be subject to that tax. And I understand where the idea is coming from, but I looked at the implementation model. Either it lacks clarity or it basically goes into subsidizing the government across the board in a sense that they say they will build roads, this, that. But the way I look at it is, why should a coffee farmer be responsible to building everything that the regional state does? Why can't you ask the same thing from other farmers that reside in the region? So equity becomes an issue. So you need to make it systematic. And the way that this system advocates for is, one, the R&D. If the money comes from coffee, it goes into coffee. It doesn't mean that whatever R&D you do is not going to benefit other sectors. So one of the R&D initiatives that I'm going to recommend would be, actually I'm working on already, is an AI framework. It's a governance framework for AI, because coffee in Ethiopia is not just a product, it's also a genetic resource. And that genetic resource is increasingly being digitized. And all those digitization efforts, uh, be it in the form of one of the major studies that were done in Ethiopia was Coffee Atlas. There's a lot of geographic data as to where the different coffee varieties are. That's data. That's published. That's outside there. It's a leakage. Before AI and after AI, it's a different ball game. AUDR is being implemented, the European Union Deforestation Regulation. Okay, that captures a lot of data. Farm level, integrated with satellite imagery to track deforestation, this and that. That's data. Another one, Ethiopia has collaborations with World Coffee Research. You know, they're working with the Ethiopian um, Agricultural Research Institute, uh, Ethiopian Institute for Agricultural Research, on a breeding program. There's a lot of data, sequencing this, that. Um, Recently, there was an announcement between uh, a private Ethiopian coffee company and a Brazilian research institution trying to improve coffee agronomy in Ethiopia. There's a lot of data being generated. So all these opportunities for collaboration are also potential areas for leakage, especially when you're talking about digital stuff. So in the next video, I'll be covering the details, but I just want to explain now that social goods is mandatory and it needs to go into um, issues that are already identified as a priority and have known solutions, uh, but not being done on the ground because of neglect, because of equity issues, such as like improving the livelihood of or the health status of women that brew coffee, or investing in, one of the projects I'm trying to look at is how do you improve the well-being of women that brew coffee as a business in Ethiopia, because there are a little over 100 plus thousand of them, and uh, and also trying to, it could be in health, education, agriculture, whatever it is, but it needs to be a problem with a well-known solution. But adaptation has been an issue for various reasons, including lack of resources. So the technical solution is already on the ground, but actually reaching a target is not happening. And so, cervical cancer prevention, that's something I've done for a long time, almost a decade. And one of the biggest challenges that the implementation gap exists because the infrastructure is already in the ground. Ethiopia has invested in some 2,000 facilities to do the screening and treatment. Uh, it has already invested in a higher level treatment capacity to manage large lesions in the form of LEAP facilities. It is already investing in a lot of money in cancer treatment centers, comprehensive ones, pushing the one that existed and making them 5 or 6. Uh, don't know the final decision, but they're already expanding it. I think they're now at 3 functional ones. Uh, but the missing link is that vaccination is going really well and it's moving forward. Uh, but the women that are already old and are eligible for secondary screening, they're not getting even the screen and treat program that is already existing on the ground is not being managed well uh, for various reasons, including lack of resources, because donors don't really prioritize cervical cancer prevention. And it's already up for elimination by 2030. That's the target, and we're nowhere near that. And also the integration of DNA testing to determine if a woman is HPV infected or not, because that's what causes cervical cancer. The great majority of it, 99% of it or so. So these are the kind of things you need to invest in. The technical solution is already out there. You're not trying to figure out anything. The R&D goes, so this is for the community, Ethiopians across the board. So it's a social contract kind of tool. The R&D component, that's for meant to benefit primarily the champion input that you're using. But your outcome could be used for something else. For example, if you do an AI governance framework, it shouldn't be, the concern is not just how to handle coffee data, but it is also to handle human data. Because remember, Ethiopia and other Rift Valley countries, actually Africa as a continent, is home to the genetic diversity of human beings. Okay. I think when they're trying to determine and calculate, uh, Africans tend to have, the majority of the genetic diversity for human beings. Okay, so that's real valuable data for medicine, for biotechnology businesses, and the like. And in the age of AI, that extraction is going to happen if it's already, you know. So what I'm looking at is, the Nagoya Protocol. There are a lot of databases out there, um, CABI and the like. So you basically have to build a system to make sure that, one, you're protecting your data in a sovereign way, but at the same time, protection is not the answer. For you to be sovereign and sustainable doesn't mean trying to build an island. You need to find a mechanism that is mutually beneficial whenever someone is trying to use it. So for my dynamic levy, it's not just the export of raw product, but also the export of data. If you're exporting raw data, then a levy would be applied. If you're using a processed data and you're doing the data analysis and the decision making, for whatever purpose, here locally, because you're using knowledge base to do that, so you're helping build a knowledge based economy in Ethiopia, then the levy won't apply to you. So that's how you need to look at it. It's a different moving pieces. That's why you need systems thinking for this. Another big component of all this that I'm working on is a leadership development program, because you need a new mind. a new way of thinking, a new mindset to be able to manage that. So there are three things that my leadership is. So I've been a leadership coach since 2006, the end of 2006, sometime around 2007. I've delivered it for government offices. I've delivered it for students. Have delivered it for law enforcement and community workers, uh, trying to address sexual and gender-based violence, trying to address sexually reproductive health, trying to address youth empowerment. And now I've basically, and I've also used it to do team building and organizational development work over the years. That's actually where I use it most, not in a formal training. But now I've developed this leadership development program that I've called Adaptation System Accelerator. And the reason I call it adaptation is because there's a lot of adaptation that needs to take place. A government that is used to planning in a linear way, oh, we grew 5% last year, so we grow 3% this year. It's just, sometimes we need a systems perspective. When there are a lot of pieces that would be moving, the contribution of all those, even if it is linear, the outcome may not be. So you need the dynamic perspective to be able to do that. So my leadership framework, development framework, basically takes adaptive leadership, systems thinking, and metacognition, and integrates it into the leadership framework that I was trained on to do coaching, which is the UNDP Leadership for Result framework. It's a transformative leadership framework that relies a great deal on systems thinking. Uh, uh, an inquiry and the like, but I've enhanced it by adding different variables to it, uh, especially the metacognition part. So basically, metacognition is basically it asks you to think about your thinking. So I'm basically asking you to be a little crazy. I'm not writing much here because the next lecture will be about that. But the two lessons I want you to take is that the dynamic levy requires a sensitivity analysis and recalibration annually based on the crop cycle for coffee. The system will treat export of physical coffee and export of unprocessed data for coffee the same way. It also, so you invest in R&D to improve the status quo for your champion input. And the goal is to facilitate value addition locally and the transformation of the sector from, uh, you know, simple labor intensive work into a knowledge based industry. So that's the key. And the strategic venture, if anything is mature enough within the R&D channel for that specific champion input, then you do strategic venture. For example, uh, using private businesses that my wife owns, we try to do strategic venture on ourselves on the ground. But that's at the corporate scale. But nationally, imagine the Ethiopian investment holdings basically using money from such a levy to do the initial investment into coffee. One thing that Ethiopia has not done to this day is promote its coffee to global coffee consumers. And rather than doing TV ads or social media ads, the best way to do it is to open, dedicated Ethiopian coffee houses uh, in different airport terminals, not in Ethiopia, but outside. Private companies can do it, but there is a risk component that they may not be able to manage. The reason Ethiopian Investment Holding is ideally placed is because Ethiopian Airlines is part of that holdings. Ethiopian Airlines has a very strong logistics in terms both in cargo and as well as using passenger planes belly. So you can start with 1, 3, 5, whatever. Pick the busiest airports globally, open a duty-free shop that primarily serves Ethiopian coffees, and the coffees could come from different Ethiopian coffee companies. It doesn't matter even if a private company does it, but it's not about an individual company brand promotion, but rather Ethiopian coffee's brand promotion. I'm sure someone will try to do it as an individual business. That's great, you know. So that's the kind of things I want you to think about. So, and yeah, this model, the framework is already set. Some of the simulations and the sensitivity analysis is done. There are 9 projects that have been already articulated in the social goods 3, in the R&D 3, in the strategic venture 3. But basically, there is a dynamic levy for resource mobilization, and there is a, you know, um, sensitivity analysis approach to determining the right proportion of resources that need to be allocated. And you need to prioritize here. So you cannot be supporting 100 gazillion ones. And a key part that I'll start with tomorrow is that there needs to be a tipping point, meaning that the strategic uh, resource or the strategic asset cannot be used to subsidize endless engagements. Okay. Whatever project that it is investing in social goods, you need to basically say, we're going to do this. At the moment you say that, you benchmark the starting point, you determine the exit point, and the exit point is decided by logic, meaning that usually change is achieved once there's a tipping point. So anywhere between 7 to 10%. So because we're dealing with a social good, we could be a little bit more flexible, and we could say once the strategic uh, asset has supported a particular intervention in the social goods space and has reached, you know, let's say there are 100,000 women that brew coffee on the streets of Ethiopia with Jabana. And then you say, once we reach 15,000 with a stove that is designed to minimize smoke, optimize energy so that they use less charcoal, this, that, then the rest you leave it for the market. You basically close that investment and move on to the next priority item. And usually, things that contribute sustainable development should be the target. But it's country by country. Some might do it differently. Some have a blue economy, others have, agricultural economy like Ethiopia. So that's the thing. And I'll talk about more details. There's a part 2 of this video. But for now, I think an hour or so of conversation on this is enough. But what I want you to think of it is that there's a framework, there is a mechanism deciding resource allocation. However, you really need to invest in mindsets of not only the people that will manage the dynamic levy and the resource allocation, but also those, for example, I'm not asking the government to do the R&D. Okay, I'm not also asking, it could be different mechanisms. If in your system there is no sovereign wealth fund, then you manage it differently. You might give grants to different institutions. You could also do a mixed approach. I'm not here to be prescriptive in any way, shape, or form. The way I'm designing the system is that when I come in, what the local stakeholder wants to do, then I want the framework to be adjustable enough so that it accommodates you. For example, in Ethiopia, the reason I picked R&D is Ethiopia invests about less than 0.3% of its GDP in research and development. And you cannot achieve a knowledge-based society, a knowledge-based economy, industrialization, or that while you're investing so little. And for a strategic asset like coffee that generates $2.6 billion annually, I consider it to be a shame for the coffee sector to be soliciting for grants from different countries to do different interventions, and those interventions hardly involve research and development. Because without research and development, there's no innovation, there's no moving forward, there's no planning for the future. And this requires that. And another way, the reason I included strategic ventures, that I want the government to see this as a long-term benefit to it, meaning that if research and development is taking place to improve the status quo and bring in a lot of things that are mature enough for investment, that means they become value addition businesses. That means your tax base expands. So in the long term, in the medium term, it's helping you. The social goods is a form of social contract. Not only people will see coffee as a good thing for the society and invest in it, but at the same time, it's showing that you're making a difference on the ground because most of that investment goes to the public sector because the public sector is the primary channel where many things are being delivered. But regardless, it gives the government, and be it at local level or national level, the mandate to push these things. So it's not just the mandate is not just on paper, but it's also on the ground. And you have the resources. And it gives you a little bit of independence because most of your social goods